Hello and welcome back to ParticularPixels. I'm Xiaoling and this is Redeemer. You play as Vasily, an elite operative who used to work for one of the biggest weapons manufacturers in the world as a member of their security team. At some point though, the corporation decided they wanted to turn you into a cyber soldier, which of course you disagreed with, and you managed to escape and hide at a secluded monastery. After 20 years of seeking after harmony and peace, the corporation finally manages to track you down, and that's where the game starts. So Redeemer is a top-down action brawler, and you have a number of different ways that you can deal with the enemies in the game. There are specific locations where you can get environmental executions throughout all of the different levels in the game. You can throw objects to damage enemies. There are a number of melee and ranged weapons that you can pick up as well to use throughout the course of your playthrough. There are two basic attacks. You've got a single target attack and a multi-target attack, which is sort of like a sweep attack, so it'll hit a bunch of enemies in front of you. You can combine the two to do some kind of rudimentary combos, but nothing really noteworthy. So you'll find yourself button mashing for most of the time. You can also hold the button, either of the buttons, to charge up an attack. That'll do sort of a more powerful version of that attack, which in some cases will send enemies flying into walls, which actually feels pretty good. When enemies have lost enough health, you'll get an option to execute them. A little skull appears, and killing them also acts as a way to replenish a small amount of health. Now, this mechanic is quite important because there are going to be situations where you'll lose a lot of health and you're going to have to kill enemies to get your health back, because there are no health packs and there's no way to heal yourself in this game. At various points throughout the game, you'll be able to stealth kill enemies as well. As long as the enemies are unaware of your presence, you are able to instantly execute them, but this isn't going to be the norm. Most of the parts are going to be going in gung-ho with little regard for stealth, since your guy hits like a truck, and you'll be surrounded by enemies for most of the time. There are also a number of different types of enemies in the game. Some are going to be armed with melee weapons, others with firearms, some are going to be bare-fisted, and as you progress further along you'll start coming across mutants, some of which are ranged and others you'll have to deal with using firearms, and some that can only be damaged by melee weapons. Eventually though, you'll be dealing with combinations of these different enemies which make things quite difficult, so you'll be rolling around shooting, picking up weapons and using the environment to get through these different encounters. The battles in Redeemer for the most part are always intense, and the combat mechanics are pretty responsive, I found, and they were quite enjoyable for the duration of the time that I played the game. There are also a lot of different executions in the game, a fair amount of variety in the environmental executions, as every stage has different objects that you can use. There are also executions for the different weapons and for your hand-to-hand combat as well, and depending on the type of enemy that you're trying to execute. So this adds a lot of visual variety with regard to executions, and most of them are actually pretty enjoyable and rewarding to watch. The game also has a ton of different weapons, both melee and ranged weapons. There's staves, and there are poles and electric prods, there's knives, there's machetes, which keeps things varied and interesting with regard to the combat in the game, which is what it should be since the game is focused around its combat system. Unfortunately, aside from the first few stages, the rest of the game takes place underground, which was a little bit disappointing for me. Now, even though the stages varied in the way they looked, it was always corridors and rooms and corridors and rooms, and I wish there were just a few more outdoor environments in the game. I also found that toward the latter part of the game there was just too much emphasis on the ranged weapons. The game lists itself as a brawler, but to me it felt 50% like a shooter. As a brawler, I wish that the camera was a little bit more zoomed in, or at least they gave us an option to zoom in and out with the camera to, set it where you really wanted it. I think that it would have added a little bit more immersion to the actual combat itself. It would have felt more visceral because you got to see more of the detail, and I think you miss some of that detail with where the camera is currently placed. I understand that the camera needs to have some distance so that you can see more of the enemies on the screen or where they were coming from, especially in the sections where enemies have ranged weapons and they're shooting at you and you need to be dodging the bullets. There was also an option to hold control and nudge the camera from the top or the bottom or the left or right so you could see a little bit further in each direction. But honestly, I never really used that during my playthrough because the nudge was so small that it made very little difference, and there was really no point to use it at all, so I'm not even sure why they included it. I also think that the combo system in the game is kind of shallow and didn't really serve any purpose, so whether you're doing combos or whether you're just randomly button mashing or just punching a whole bunch of different separate hits, it didn't really seem to have any impact in the damage you did or any impact in the game, so you just end up button mashing, and I think I would have liked to have seen more depth here, that combos would have made more of a difference because there were benefits to using these different combos in the game. And again, as I mentioned before, towards the latter half of the game, there is way too much reliance on ranged weapons, and the game becomes more of a shooter at that point, since you are going to get swarmed by enemies who can take a ton of melee damage, and you want to kill them, because if you don't, you are going to get overrun. So here's an example. You're fighting a tough enemy with your fists, 2 more arrive, so you start rolling around to avoid their damage, or you can just parry the hits while still trying to focus down the first guy. While you're in this fight, 2 new enemies arrive with rifles and they start shooting at you. Now you have to deal with these guys with rifles quickly, because otherwise you are going to die. So you roll up to one of them, you grab the weapon out of his hand, or you knock him down and you pick up the weapon off the floor. Either way, you have a rifle in your hand now, and at that point it makes sense to gun down the guy and then gun down the other ranged threat. After that's done, you probably have some ammo left, so you may as well use it on the remaining enemies that are trying to kill you. And if you don't have any ammo left, just pick up the gun from the other guy on the ground and then gun down the enemies, because when you get to the next group, the same thing's going to happen again. So once you've been through certain sections of some stages, some areas you can go back to, and there'll be just melee weapons lying around, there'll be pistols lying around. Since most weapons have ammo limitation and most melee weapons have a durability bar, you can't use them indefinitely, obviously, but there's so much stuff lying around after you've made your way through parts of stages, you can always just run back and pick them up to help you in encounters further on in each stage. The game is also not that long. It'll take about 5 to 7 hours to play through the campaign on normal difficulty, depending on how fast you play. Replayability wise, there is a hardcore mode as well for those of you who want a hard experience, but the game's pretty tough at the end of the game. Tough enough that I think that some people are going to find it quite frustrating to play certain sections of the game. However, if you want more replayability, there is the hardcore mode, like I said, and there are also 2 arenas that you can play through where you have to survive against X amount of waves of enemies, but unfortunately there are only 2 arenas in the game at the moment, and I have no idea if they plan on adding more. Otherwise, I didn't come across too many issues with the game. When the game launched, there were some weird frame rate drops at certain sections of certain stages, but that seems to have been fixed now. I did come across some sections where the frame rate dropped into the low 60s, which was a little bit of a surprise considering that the game doesn't look amazing and I'm running on a relatively high-end PC, so I'm not sure if that's going to cause problems with people with lower specs. Also, I do have to say that G-Sync didn't work for me in this particular game. I kept my FPS at 144, so making sure it wasn't going over my refresh rate, and I was still getting tearing in both full screen and windowed mode. In order for me to remedy this, I did have to enable V-Sync, which I suppose defeats the point of getting a G-Sync screen, doesn't it? But it's not game breaking, but for those of you with G-Sync screens, you should be aware of this issue. Outside of that, I have actually enjoyed my time with Redeemer. It's not a bad game, it's entertaining and actually doesn't require too much thought. It's easy to pick up and just play for a bit, and it's enjoyable. I think that the hardest sections of the game will no doubt be frustrating for some people, and as I said earlier, if the hardest sections aren't hard enough for some of you hardcore gamers out there, there is the hardcore difficulty setting, so that's going to at least add some replayability for you. The game's not perfect, but it is worth playing, and I think I'd recommend that you pick it up on special if you do plan on doing so. I'm not sure that I'd recommend this game at full price. Anyways, that's been a look at Redeemer. If you guys enjoyed the video, drop a like. If you didn't, there's a dislike button as well. And don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more content like this. Thanks for watching. I've been Xiaoling. Until next time.